It seems, as Seville also claimed, that Morgan was the boss.
Let him help you because I've got a place in my organization for you, but you've got to prove yourself.
Seville told us he was reluctant to call Yancey, but Morgan badgered him to do it. Once again, the tape seems to bear him out.
You call me. Just call me. I'm worried about you not calling. I told him you would call me, and then you'll know how real I am. Just call me.
One day before his release, Seville made the call, which was also tape recorded.
Yeah. Yeah, is this Yancey?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Seville calling from Perryville.
Hey, what's happening?
Yeah, Tom told me to call you. He said, you might have work for me when I get out.
Yeah, I think we can help each other out.
Yeah.
As you recall, Seville claims that when he went back to his cell, Morgan told him he had just joined the mob, and now Seville had to kill the sheriff because Morgan's underworld reputation was on the line.
I'll tell you right now, you're expensive to me. I told you so much about you, and you got to be faithful to the words that I've given.
And he said, "Don't double-cross me?"
Don't double-cross me, you know what will happen.
Which means?
You know what will happen. That was pretty much left up to my imagination.
But soon, Seville says, Morgan left nothing to the imagination, explicitly threatening Seville and his family if Jimmy didn't kill the sheriff. That's a key part of Seville's story and basic to his claim of entrapment.
You got a bad investigation, and you're about to arrest a person that has been coerced and threatened and entrapped into committing a crime.
But now we come to a key glitch in Jimmy Seville's story. Those threats aren't on the tape. As it happens, the tape's made right after the phone call, right at the time Seville claims Morgan threatened him, are either blank or silent. How could that happen? Seville's attorney says he had the recordings analyzed by an expert. The finding, the tapes were rolling the whole time, but
The volume was turned down so that you could not hear the conversation on the tape.
at critical points.
Yes.
Accidental or deliberate?
You tell me.
A staggering implication. It's one thing to think that a cellmate with a wild imagination cooked up a plot and got Seville in trouble, but to imply that investigators turned down their own tape recorders is to accuse them of participating in Thomas Morgan's scheme.
Recording devices fail sometimes.
Jack McIntyre is the legal counsel to Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the alleged victim of Seville's alleged plot. So if someone sees a sinister purpose in this, the sheriff's office may have either not recorded certain conversations or blanked out certain conversations. That's just paranoia.
They're the same people that are monitoring Area 51 and waiting for the spaceship to take off every moment of every day.
He has a point. Of course, Seville's tales about Morgan sounded pretty bizarre too, until it turned out there were tape recordings to back them up. Now, what if there were also tape recordings showing that the entire time Thomas Morgan was cooking up his plot with Jimmy Seville, he was also working closely with detectives employed by the alleged victim, Sheriff Joe Arpaio? What if the sheriff's department's own tapes showed that detectives actually dictated to Morgan some of the stories that Seville says sucked him in? Impossible, right? Just wait and see.
Could the target of this murder scheme somehow be involved in it?
He's got a whole unit dedicated towards investigating threats. Sort of the ego of, I'm important and people are out to get me.
As the plot thickens. Dateline with Stone Phillips continues as the plot thickens.
James Seville was sitting in jail, charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in a plot to blow up Arizona's most popular lawman, Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Seville and his lawyers made a remarkable claim that even though he'd been caught on tape building a bomb and bragging about wanting to kill the sheriff, Seville had really been set up by a cellmate named Thomas Morgan, who threatened his life if he didn't assassinate Arpaio. He told you that you should.
He told me that I had to.
They found secret tape recordings made in prison by sheriff's investigators that seemed to support some of Seville's claims that Morgan was the driving force in the plot.
Joe, gave you a lot of money
But Seville's lawyer, Ulises Ferragut, makes another, even more serious claim, that the sheriff's office itself dictated much of what Morgan said on those tapes, in effect, helping to set up James Seville.
One of the fundamental requirements is that you not entrap the person by creating or suggesting the crime. And that's exactly what the sheriff's office did.
Was it possible the sheriff's department had helped railroad Jimmy Seville in a plot to assassinate the sheriff himself? It's the kind of thing no one would believe unless there was extremely convincing evidence, like, say, another trove of tape recordings, which is exactly what Seville's defense team obtained from the sheriff's department and shared with Dateline.
Prairieville Prison, we're going to talk to Thomas Morgan. Do you know what we're here about?
Pretty sure, yeah.
Okay.
June 30th, 1999, 9 days before Jimmy Seville would be released onto the streets of Phoenix, Maricopa County Sheriff's detectives were meeting for the first time with inmate Thomas Morgan, who said he had information that was, if you'll pardon the expression, explosive.
I'm in a cell with a nut, and he literally wants to kill his judge and his prosecutor. He just says he's going to send him a bomb and blow him up, kill him.
What's his name?
David, Seville.
Seville.
Right.
Ferragut says Morgan had informed on cellmates before, trying to negotiate favorable treatment in return.
He had basically snitched on 2 other individuals in murder cases prior to Jimmy Seville.
Now Morgan was fingering Seville. Detectives had received this letter Morgan wrote to his minister 2 weeks before Seville was scheduled to be released. What I'm about to tell you is very important and dangerous. I have recently learned of a plot to kill a Superior Court judge and a prosecutor. Morgan then goes on to name the intended victims. Names you'll remember Seville says Morgan wheedled out of him. The young man has given me explicit details on how he was going to do it. He is quite knowledgeable for his young age with explosives. I believe he knows what he is doing. Morgan says he has bomb diagrams, the ones Seville claims Morgan asked him to draw. Then, 3 paragraphs later, Morgan adds what seems like an afterthought. He talks about killing Sheriff Joe also.
It sounded like a very serious threat.
Jack McIntyre is chief counsel for the sheriff's office. He's talking to us because Sheriff Joe didn't want to. Because the threat mentioned specific names, you sort of took it as being more credible than otherwise.
Oh, sure.
It probably didn't hurt that the sheriff himself was one of the names. He happened to be both the most famous lawman in Arizona and the boss of the 2 detectives sent to interview Thomas Morgan. Is it any kind of conflict of interest, do you think, to have the sheriff's office investigating a threat against the sheriff?
I don't think there's any conflict there at all. That happens all the time. In every law enforcement agency.
That may be true, but it's also true that there may be no other law enforcement agency quite like the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Joe Arpaio is an elected official who's kept the highest profile he could create over the 12 years he's held office. His name is writ large on every facility he runs. His chain gang and tent city jail are known across the country. It's a rare week when Sheriff Joe is not quoted in the local news media. And a big part of his mystique is that Sheriff Joe fights crime despite constant threats on his life. The sheriff's office sent us a list of 10 people who've been convicted of threatening Sheriff Joe in just the last 5 years. Critics, like Ulises Ferragut, say that while some threats certainly are serious, the sheriff's department isn't above milking them for publicity.
Sort of the ego of, I'm important and people are out to get me. And his staff know this. In fact, he's got a whole unit dedicated towards threats, investigating threats.
Those 2 sheriff's investigators would have a pretty clear motive for focusing in on the plot to kill Sheriff Arpaio.
Oh, absolutely. Can you imagine? Hey, boss, look what we brought you. We come bearing gifts.
Ferragut points to the fact that at the first meeting, Morgan did not even mention the sheriff until the detectives did.
And is that the only people he's threatened? Is the prosecutor?
Yeah, that's the only one that he's openly talked about.
How about the one in their letter he talked about? He made threats to Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Oh, he said he'd be a hero if he blew up Sheriff Joe.
Cops will tell you that an experienced informant like Thomas Morgan reads the signals about what information is wanted and what he can trade for favors. Doesn't the fact that the detectives bring up Sheriff Arpaio in that first meeting with Morgan, doesn't that send a signal to Thomas Morgan that this is what we're really interested in here?
You know, I think you could probably read it that way, but I think in all fairness, they talked about all three.
But as detectives began listening to and recording Morgan's talks with James Seville, the investigation seemed to focus solely on the famous sheriff.
More than he wants the judge, he wants that prosecutor. He thrives on this prosecutor.
Not too many people know a prosecutor. He's not well known. Everybody knows Ohio.
Listen to how detectives told Morgan to describe Yancey, the undercover detective they wanted Seville to call.
If we can get him hooked up with a guy that will say, call his name Yancey, he's got some money, and he might be able to make it worth your while to, you know, maybe make something for him, to make a bomb, something like that. Cause
oh, he'll do it.
He really wants our pile back, because he doesn't like our pile at all.
I think he'd do it.
McIntyre says the detectives had to push hard and work quickly because Seville was about to be released from prison and they wanted to make sure they hooked him up with an undercover officer so they could keep track of him. But he also admits that when Seville was released from prison and did meet with Yancey, their bomb shopping spree was actually underwritten by the sheriff's office. Mr. Seville does not even have a driver's license.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Yancey's driving. Who's paying for the bomb parts?
Well, I think it's Yancey.
Whose vehicle is it?
It's Yancey's.
That's not you guys making this happen?
Oh, no, we could have very well been driving them to Circle K to get some Fritos, but Mr. Seville made the choices of what to get and where.
Good point. But what about the timing of the arrest? McIntyre admits Seville could have been arrested after he bought the first bomb part, or the last, or after he built the bomb, or after he took the money for doing that. Yet the undercover detective actually took Seville to a restaurant where the sheriff was having lunch, where the sheriff's car was parked, and where a local TV news crew had been tipped to show up with cameras rolling. Whether or not the investigation was legitimate, it's pretty tough to argue that the arrest was not planned for cameras.
It was pretty convenient to have a television crew that was there and available.
The defense now had a theory of the case that a cunning informant and a publicity-hungry sheriff's office conspired to entrap James Seville. They had audio tapes that supported some of their claims, but were they willing to bet Seville's life that a jury would believe them?
The judge told Jimmy and his family very directly. He said, son, I've been doing this for, over 30 years, and I can tell you that no one wins an entrapment defense.
The prosecution offered a deal: plead guilty to attempted aggravated assault and be sentenced to 10 to 15 years. With time served, Seville could get out in as little as 6. For Ulises Ferragut, it was time for a gut check.
When I'm looking at an 18-year-old kid who is facing life in prison, I have a responsibility to say to him, Jimmy, as much as I believe in you and your family believes in you, you need to be cautious here.
Seville's mom, Rebecca, had the same painful realization. You were telling him, take the deal.
Yes, I was. I wanted him to have a life and not in prison.
By now, Jimmy Seville had been in jail for 4 years. A guilty plea meant at least 6 more. But in the end, he went for the deal.
And finally, I agreed to take it, because it was pretty stupid not to take it.
Seville pleaded guilty to the lesser charge, even though he and his family and his lawyers were all convinced he was not guilty. And then, as if this story weren't strange enough already,
we got to the office, and I get a phone call from the prosecutor. And he says, listen, there's a technical defect in the plea.
It was a tiny paperwork matter, a mistake in the reporting of Seville's criminal history, but the plea itself could not be finalized without correcting it. Ferragut told the prosecutor he'd get back to him on making the change, but then the phone rang again. This time it was the sheriff's sergeant who had been in charge of surveillance on the day of Jimmy Seville's arrest, and who was no fan of Sheriff Joe Arpaio's regime.
And he starts telling me, he says, look, I don't feel good about the investigation, and I don't feel good about your client taking a plea. And as he starts telling me this, I start scrambling for a tape recorder.
In a case full of key moments caught on tape, here's the capper.
I mean, if I've ever seen anybody coerced or set up, it was him.
And you think it was all for sort of the publicity angle for the sheriff?
Oh, look at the news cameras that were there at the time of the arrest.
Ferragut rushed to the jail and told Seville.
And I said, listen, here's the scenario. You've got a bad plea, and we've got an undercover officer that says it's a bad case. What do you want to do? And Jimmy said, I want out of my plea.
What did the prosecutor say when you said, I want to void the plea agreement?
Basically, are you crazy? We've got him on tape making a bomb. Are you crazy?
And you said?
We might be.
And now the conclusion of The Plot Thickens on Dateline with Stone Phillips.
Were you nervous during the trial?
I was kind of happy because for the whole time I was in there, I was determined to go to trial.
James Seville had been in jail 4 years, awaiting trial for allegedly conspiring to murder one of Arizona's most popular elected officials, Sheriff Joe Arpaio. He'd been caught on tape building a bomb intended for the sheriff, but he claimed he'd been entrapped, coerced into committing the crime by a jailhouse informant and by the sheriff's department itself. The sheriff's lawyer, Jack McIntyre, thought Seville's entrapment claim was patently bogus.
It was a creation that was made strictly for the point of view of presenting it to a jury and seeing if they'll bite on that hook.
In a pretrial deposition, the informant, Thomas Morgan, said the murder plot was all Seville's idea, that he, Morgan, did not exaggerate it to win favors, nor did the detectives tell him to do it.
At no time did they tell me to entrap this kid. At no time did they tell me to entice this kid.
Now a jury would decide whether Morgan was lying or whether Seville was. The trial took 5 weeks. Jurors heard tape after scratchy tape. They heard sheriff's detectives seeming to instruct their informant to play up the threat on Sheriff Joe.
Well, not too many people know Prosecutor. He's not well known. Everybody knows Arpaio.
They heard Morgan chat up Seville about killing Sheriff Joe.
Someone paid you to blow up Joe, gave you a lot of money. Good?
They heard sheriff's detectives proposing to set Seville up with a friend on the outside.